Title, The Original. Consider the curious architecture of selfhood. We build it brick by brick over 40 years, the particular way we laugh, the coffee order memorized by a spouse, the scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle, and a driveway that still exists in a town we no longer visit. We believe these things make us irreplaceable. We believe identity is a fortress, but what if it is instead a house of cards? And what if someone who knows every card, every stack, every trembling tier decides one morning to sit down at your table? Welcome, if you dare, to Clearwater Estates, where every home looks exactly like every other home, and one man is about to discover that this was never a coincidence. The development had been built in 2019 on what used to be a soybean field outside Columbus, and the builder's brochure had called it a community of intentional sameness, which was marketing language for, we poured 47 identical foundations and hope you find it charming. The Hendersons at 14 Clearwater Circle had painted their shutters navy to distinguish themselves from the Patels at 16, who had painted theirs green, who were themselves distinguishable from the Ortegas at 18 only by a ceramic rooster on the porch that Marlena Ortega had won at a state fair in 2021 and displayed with the pride of a woman who had climbed a mountain. Paul Keswick lived at 12. His shutters were still the builder's standard colonial white because he'd been meaning to paint them for 3 years and something always came up. His lawn was mowed, if not inspired. His gutters held a modest archaeology of last autumn's leaves that he was also meaning to address. He was, by his own admission, and by the consensus of everyone who knew him without strongly disliking him, a decent man. He coached his son's soccer team with more enthusiasm than tactical knowledge. He remembered his wife Dana's dry cleaning more often than he forgot it. He had a slight overbite that he'd stopped being self-conscious about at 37, a habit of humming without melody when he concentrated, and a scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident at age 9 on the driveway of his parents' house in Chillicothe, Ohio, a driveway that was now, as of his father's death and his childhood home sale 3 years ago, a stranger's driveway. Though Paul still drove by it sometimes on visits home, out of some reflex he couldn't name. He sold commercial insurance, he was good at it, he didn't love it. He was, in summary, a complete human being, not extraordinary, not invisible, but specific. Particular himself. The house at 10 Clearwater Circle had been empty for 11 months. In a development of 47 identical houses, this made it notable. It sat like a gap in a row of teeth, its windows blank, its lawn serviced by the HOA's contract mower, but not loved by any personal hand. Paul had grown used to its emptiness, the way you grow used to a space where a piece of furniture used to be. He stopped noticing it sometime in February. He noticed it on a Thursday in April when a moving truck appeared. He was carrying recycling to the curb, the blue bin, because it was a blue week, and he paused in his driveway with the bin in both hands and watched the truck back in with its hydraulic wheeze. It was a standard rental truck, the orange kind. 2 movers in gray uniforms climbed out of the cab. They stood at the back of the truck and lowered the ramp and began to carry boxes toward the door. Paul stood with his recycling bin and felt the particular mild pleasure of a new neighbor, the anticipation of a future wave from a driveway, perhaps an eventual barbecue, the low-stakes social optimism that suburban life occasionally offers. Then the man came around from the passenger side of the truck's cab, where he'd apparently been sitting, and Paul's recycling bin hit the driveway with a sound like a gunshot. Plastic bottles rolled across the concrete. Paul didn't move to collect them. The man was 40 years old, give or take. He had dark brown hair that had gone silver at the temples in the specific pattern that Paul's had. He had a slight overbite. He was wearing a blue quarter zip that Paul owned, or a quarter zip identical to it, and he moved with a particular forward lean that Paul recognized the way you recognize a word in your own handwriting. The man stopped at the end of the driveway and looked at the house, and then, with the unhurried ease of someone completing an errand he'd done 100 times, looked at Paul. He smiled. It was Paul's smile, the left side slightly higher, the expression arriving a half-beat late, as though the fates was always reconsidering. "You must be the neighbor," the man said. Paul stood on his driveway in the April afternoon and thought, with a clarity that felt absurd, and therefore true, that is my face. He didn't tell Dana that night. He sat across from her at the dinner table and watched her and their son Marcus, 14, and recently sullen in the specifically temporary way of 14-year-olds, and he tried to find language for what he'd seen. Every sentence he constructed dissolved before it reached his mouth. "There's a man next door who looks exactly like me," sounded like the beginning of a mental health episode. He was not having a mental health episode. He was, to his knowledge, a man with no particular history of such things. A man who had gone to his last physical in October and been told his cholesterol was borderline and he should eat more fiber. He ate his pasta. "You're quiet," Dana said. "Long day," Paul said. She accepted this because it was usually true. After Marcus disappeared upstairs into the blue glow of whatever Marcus disappeared into, Paul poured a second glass of wine and told her there was a new neighbor at 10. "I know," Dana said. "I saw the truck. Did you meet them?" "Him. I think it's just him." He paused. "He looks like me." Dana looked up from her phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean he looks like me. Significantly, like a lot." She studied him. "People have doppelgangers," she said. "There are only so many faces, right?" Paul said. "Sure." He lay awake until 2 in the morning, which he never did on Saturday morning. The man knocked on the door with a bottle of wine. Paul answered, because Paul was the one who answered the door when Dana was elsewhere in the house, which was their unconscious domestic arrangement. He opened the door and stood face to face with himself, with the man in the bright April light, and the specificity of it hit him again like a physical thing, not just the face, but the posture, the particular way the man held the wine bottle with his thumb across the neck, the way Paul himself held bottles. "Paul Keswick," the man said, extending his free hand. "What are the odds?" Paul shook the hand. It was his hand, the same broad palm, the same slight callus on the ring finger, from years of writing with pens gripped too hard. "I'm also Paul," the man said, as though this were mildly amusing. "Paul Reiser, moving into 10. "Paul Keswick," Paul said, though the man had already used his name. Paul Reiser smiled that asymmetrical smile and handed over the wine. It was a good bottle, a Willamette Valley Pinot, which was Paul Keswick's preferred wine when he wasn't defaulting to whatever was on sale, which was most of the time. The specificity of the choice landed somewhere in Paul's chest and sat there. They stood in the doorway for a moment, two men with identical faces arranging their expressions into normalcy. "Well," Paul Reiser said, "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other." He walked back to 10 with his hands in his pockets. Paul stood in his doorway and watched him go. And the sensation he felt was not fear exactly, but the cousin of fear. The feeling of a floor that has not yet given way, but that you have just tentatively stepped onto. The gaslighting, if that's what it was, began so gradually that Paul couldn't identify the starting point. The way you can't identify the exact moment a room has grown dark. It began with small things, memories. At Marcus's soccer game 3 weeks into April, Paul was standing on the sideline with the other parents when Paul Reiser appeared. Apparently he'd learned about the game from someone. He'd explained when Paul asked, just around the neighborhood, "You know how it is?" He was standing 20 feet away on the same sideline, and 3 different parents drifted toward him over the course of the game, and he spoke with each of them for longer than seemed warranted by a new neighbor. Afterward, crossing the parking lot, Tom Haggerty from 6 Clearwater fell into step with Paul and said, without looking over, "Hey, Paul, you mentioned that your kid played for Lightning?" "Yeah," Paul said. "He's played for them for 2 years. Tom nodded slowly. "Right. Yeah, of course." He peeled off toward his own car in a way that felt like relief. At home, Dana mentioned that she'd invited the neighbor to the block party. Paul said he hadn't known about a block party. Dana said the email had gone out 3 weeks ago. Paul said he hadn't seen it. Dana showed him his own inbox. The email was there, opened on April 8th. He couldn't remember opening it. He took his phone to his home office and sat at his desk and stared at the email. It had been opened at 7:14 in the morning when he was usually in the shower. He left the office and stood in the hallway outside Marcus's door. From inside came the usual ambient noise, the sound of a boy being somewhere else in the world via a headset. Paul knocked. Marcus opened the door wearing the headset around his neck, the mild interruption tolerance of someone between games. "Hey," Paul said. "Quick question. Did I talk to you about the block party?" Marcus frowned. "Yeah. You mentioned it like a month ago, right? And did I?" He stopped. He didn't know how to finish the sentence without sounding unwell. "Never mind. Thanks, bud." He stood in the hallway after Marcus closed the door and listened to the house around him. Its familiar sounds. The refrigerator cycling on, the particular creak of the 3rd step from the top of the stairs, which he'd been meaning to fix. Paul Reiser was easy to like, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about him. He had Paul's quality of making people feel heard, that particular attentiveness that Paul had always considered his own better trait, that slight forward lean when someone was speaking, The way of repeating a key word from your last sentence to show the listening was genuine. Paul watched him deploy it at the block party with the ease of a native speaker and felt a vertiginous sensation of watching his own reflection do something. "He's great," Dana said, standing beside Paul with a plastic cup of lemonade, watching Paul Reiser laugh with Tom Haggerty's wife about something, and the laugh carried across the cul-de-sac. "He's fine," Paul said. She glanced at him. "You don't have to be weird about the resemblance." "I'm not being weird," she sipped her lemonade. "I just think it's kind of funny, honestly. You two could be brothers." Paul watched Paul Reiser put his hand briefly on Mrs. Haggerty's arm to make a point, a gesture of emphasis and warmth, and felt something tighten in his chest. "Yeah?" Paul said. "Funny." In May, something shifted. It happened incrementally, and then suddenly the way all erosions work. Paul began to notice that when he told stories he'd told before, the bicycle accident, the scar above the eyebrow, the Chillicothe driveway, people received them with a faint unease, a polite adjustment of expression, as though he'd told a joke whose punchline they'd heard. He noticed that at two separate dinner parties, he'd made a comment that was met with laughter, and then, 2 minutes later, Paul Reiser made the same comment, or near enough, and received laughter that was larger, more organic, the laughter of first contact. He began keeping note. In a small pocket notebook that he carried, but that he now kept locked in his car's glove box, he wrote, "Things I remember, things he claims, discrepancies." The problem with the notebook was that the discrepancies were never clean. They were matters of interpretation, of emphasis. He remembered telling Dana about his father's death on a Sunday. She said it was a Saturday. He was certain it was Sunday because there'd been a game on. She said he'd never mentioned a game. He was certain, she was certain. His certainty began to feel untrustworthy. In early June, at a neighborhood gathering at the Patel's house, the one with the green shutters, Paul told the story of his first date with Dana, the restaurant that got his reservation wrong, the second restaurant that got their order wrong, the rain, the 3-block run to his car, Dana's hair, which had done something extraordinary in the rain that he'd been trying to describe accurately for 15 years. He told this story with the pleasure of a man opening a good bottle. He watched Dana's face as he told it. Her face did something he didn't have language for, a flicker of something prior to her expression settling into the warm, listening face she wore for stories she'd heard before. But he saw the prior thing. He was certain he saw it. Later that night, he asked her, "Did you like that story?" And she said yes, she always did, and kissed him. And he lay awake again and understood that what he'd seen might have been something else entirely, that he was now interpreting his wife's face the way you interpret noise in the walls, searching for structure in what might be nothing. In July, his boss called him Paul Reiser. It was a minor thing, a slip immediately corrected, followed by a laugh about confusion, but his boss had called him Paul Reiser. And Paul sat in the hall for the rest of the hour and could not tell whether he'd misheard it. He had not. He played it back in his memory with the obsessive clarity of a man rewinding a tape he's already rewound 11 times. He went next door. He knocked on the door of 10 Clearwater Circle and waited on the steps in the July heat. Paul Reiser answered in a way that suggested he'd been expecting the visit. He was holding a spatula. "Dinner," he said, gesturing inside. "But come in. I'm not here for dinner." "Okay." Paul Reiser stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door partially closed behind him. He was patient in a way Paul found unbearable. "Who are you?" Paul said, not as a question, as a declaration. Paul Reiser looked at him with an expression that was almost compassionate. "I'm Paul Reiser. I live here. You look exactly like me." "You look like me," Paul Reiser said gently. "I was here first. You moved in April." "I've lived here. I moved in April," Paul Reiser agreed. "You moved in May." "You and Dana and Marcus," the name landed in Paul's chest like a stone into still water. "You know my family's names. They're my neighbors." A pause. "Paul, I'm not trying to make this harder. I understand this is disorienting for you. I want you to know that I don't think you're lying. I think you genuinely believe what you believe." He said this the way a very careful person says very careful things. "But I've lived here since April 3rd. I have the lease. I have mail from March. I have photos of me in this house." He stopped. "I think you should see someone. A doctor?" Or Paul left. He sat in his car in his own driveway and gripped the steering wheel and thought about the scar above his eye, the bicycle, the driveway in Chillicothe. These were his things. A man could not simply acquire them. He called his mother. She answered on the third ring with the particular warmth of a mother who worries and has learned to hide the worrying. He asked her to tell him about the bicycle accident. She did, the same story he'd always known. Chillicothe, the driveway, the blood, his father carrying him inside. He felt the relief of confirmation. He felt himself on solid ground. Then she said, "Is everything all right, sweetheart? It's been so long since we've spoken." 4 months, he had called her last week. Silence. "Last week," he said. "I called you last week." A pause on her end. He could hear her patience, her care, the delicacy of the moment. "Honey," she said, "that wasn't you." He went through his phone's call history. The call to his mother that he remembered making Sunday, June 28th, 11 minutes, was there. He could see the call. The phone showed the outgoing call, the duration, the timestamp. He called the carrier. He sat on hold for 43 minutes and then spoke to a representative who confirmed that the call had been made from his number at the listed time. He went to his mother's house the following weekend. He drove to her house in Worthington, where she'd moved after his father died, and he sat in her living room, and they had coffee, and he watched her face. She was warm. She was his mother. She touched his face with her hand when she reached for him, the gesture of a woman who had touched that face since its beginning, but her eyes, he watched her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching, held something that looked less like recognition than like adjustment, like a woman looking at something familiar that had arrived in an unexpected shape. He didn't ask about the phone call again. He drove home on the interstate and watched Ohio unspool past him, and tried to understand what was happening to him. He thought, "What if I am not who I think I am?" He thought. "That's insane," he thought. "Is it?" In August, Dana sat him down. She sat him down the way people sit people down, with the deliberate quiet of someone who has rehearsed. She had coffee ready. It was a Sunday. Marcus was at a friend's house. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at him with the particular expression he associated with her at her most serious. "I need you to see someone," she said, "a therapist or a doctor. I've already looked into Dana, Paul. I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be completely honest." She waited. "How long have we lived here?" he said. She didn't hesitate. "Since May." "May," he repeated. "We moved in May 14th. I have the, what about before May? Where did we live?" She looked at him. Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read, and later he would replay this moment the way he'd replayed his boss's slip, the way he'd replayed his mother's pause, cataloging it among the things that might mean nothing and might mean everything. "Linden Avenue," she said. "We had the apartment for 2 years before we saved enough for the down payment." "What apartment?" She stopped, looked at him carefully. "On Linden." "What was the address?" 2 on 14. "Paul, why are you... What was our neighbor's name?" I don't remember their name. I barely knew them." "What did the kitchen look like?" It was... She stopped again. Her eyes went somewhere interior, and he watched her face and saw something he would later describe to no one because he had no one to describe it to. He saw her reaching, searching. The way you search for a word in a language you once studied and have mostly let go. She found something. "The cabinets were white," she said, "and the counters were that speckled laminate." Her voice, by the end of the sentence, had regained its certainty, and Paul didn't know, could not know, whether this was memory or reconstruction, whether she was remembering or whether she'd been told something that had filled in a space where memory should have been. He couldn't know. That was the point. That night, he sat in his car in the driveway for 45 minutes. He took out the notebook from the glove box and opened it to the first page. His own handwriting, his specific identifiable handwriting with its slight backward slant, filled the pages. Things I remember. Things he claims, discrepancies. He read through it and understood that he had started this notebook in April and that by now it contained 3 months of careful documentation. He turned to the last page with writing. Someone had added a note in his handwriting. At the bottom of the last entry in the same backward slanted pen, it said, "Why do you keep writing this down? You already know how it ends." He stood at the door of 10 Clearwater Circle at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, when Dana was asleep and the development was dark and quiet. Paul Reiser answered in a robe. He looked at Paul for a moment with neither surprise nor satisfaction, just a kind of worn readiness, as though he'd been expecting this knock not on this night, but on some night. "I found the note," Paul said. Paul Reiser stepped aside. Paul went in. The house was the mirror image of his own, the same floor plan, reversed, but it was inhabited in a way that felt heavy, established, real, in a way that made Paul's chest constrict. Family photos on the walls. Bookshelves with the specific organization of a man's particular mind. A wedding photo on the mantel, Paul Reiser and Dana, looking young, looking happy, looking exactly as Paul remembered the actual photograph on his own mantel, from which he and Dana looked young and happy. He stood in front of the mantel and looked at the photo for a long time. "You can have one clear answer," Paul Reiser said behind him, "or you can have the life." Paul turned. "What?" "That's the choice." Paul Reiser sat in an armchair, the same model armchair that Paul had bought 2 years ago, or believed he'd bought, and looked at Paul with the exhausted clarity of a man who'd given this speech before, or prepared to give it for a long time. "If you want to know exactly what happened, I can tell you all of it. What I am, where I came from, the mechanism, you'll understand perfectly. And then what?" "You tell Dana? She won't remember the apartment on Linden any better than she already doesn't, because she never lived there. You tell Marcus? He doesn't know anything about a life in a house that doesn't exist anymore." He paused. "Or you go back across the lawn and live the life, your life, the one that's yours, the one where you coach Marcus's soccer team and sell commercial insurance and keep meaning to paint the shutters." Paul stood and breathed. "The note in the notebook," he said, "to be fair, you wrote it. I just knew you would." "That doesn't make sense. Very little about this does." Paul looked at the wedding photo again. Dana's face, young and mid-laugh, blurred at the edges from motion. His own face, or Paul Reiser's face, the distinction now felt like a language he was losing, looking at her with the specific expression of a man seeing something extraordinary. "Which one of us is the copy?" Paul said. Paul Reiser was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully. "That's the question you have to decide whether you actually want answered." Paul stood in the lamplight of the reversed house. He thought about the bicycle, the driveway in Chillicothe, the particular way the third step from the top of the stairs creaked in his house, in the house across the strip of lawn, in the dark. He thought about Marcus's face when he opened the bedroom door, the mild, temporary irritation of a boy between games, the face Paul had watched change over 14 years from the face of an infant he'd held in a delivery room, or remembered holding, or had been told he'd held until the telling became memory. He thought, "The memories are mine." And then, below that, the quieter thought, "But so are his." He crossed the lawn. He went upstairs. He did not look in the mirror in the bathroom, which was a choice or perhaps the absence of one. He lay down beside Dana, who shifted without waking, who reached toward him with the unconscious accuracy of 15 years of sharing a bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. The refrigerator, cycling on, the third step settling in the quiet. The ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a life, he told himself. "This is mine," he told himself this several times. By morning, he almost believed it. He painted the shutters in September, colonial blue, not navy like the Hendersons, but close. He rented the sprayer from the hardware store and did it on a Saturday, while Marcus held the ladder with the indifferent helpfulness of a teenager discharging an obligation. From 10 Clearwater Circle, across the trim strip of lawn, Paul Reiser watched for a while from his driveway with coffee, the way neighbors do, before eventually going back inside. He didn't wave. Paul didn't wave. They had arrived, without discussion, at a certain equilibrium, the equilibrium of two men who share a property line and a face, and an understanding that some things are better left as they are. The shutters came out well. Dana came out to look at them at noon and stood in the driveway with her hands on her hips. "They're good," she said. "I've been meaning to do it." "I know." She bumped his shoulder with hers, and he bumped back, and they stood and looked at the house that was their house, with its shutters that were now specifically, identifiably, irreducibly theirs. Paul thought about the notebook which he had thrown away, which he no longer needed, the question inside it settled or set aside, which perhaps amounted to the same thing. He thought, "I remember everything." He thought, "That's enough." He held the sprayer in both hands and looked at his house and felt, with a completeness that was either genuine or willed or some proportion of both, that he had decided not to calculate, that he was home. Paul Keswick painted his shutters colonial blue and lived, by most observable measures, happily ever after. He coached soccer, sold insurance, remembered his wife's dry cleaning, and never again asked which version of himself had earned the right to do so. This is either the story of a man who chose peace over truth, or the story of a man who understood that in a world where identity is assembled from memory, and memory is assembled from need, the bravest act is not certainty, it is commitment. Make note of your own foundations tonight, whatever you believe them to be. The mortgage, the photos, the particular creak of a stair that knows your weight. These things belong to you completely, right up until the moment someone else knows them just as well. Population of Clearwater Estates, 47 houses, 48 lives, and one question that no one at 10 or 12 Clearwater Circle will ever answer aloud. That question, of course, being, does it matter?